Bonjour, bienvenue à l'Université de Moncton. Aujourd'hui, j'ai le plaisir de vous accueillir pour une conversation avec le professeur Donald J. Savoie. Le professeur Savoie est titulaire de la chaire de recherche du Canada en gouvernance et administration publique, ici à l'Université de Moncton. Auteur de renom, le professeur Savoie a publié de nombreux livres, de nombreux articles scientifiques. Et aujourd'hui, nous avons le plaisir de discuter de son plus récent livre, le livre intitulé What is Government Good At, pour lequel il s'est vu décerner le prix d'honneur pour le meilleur ouvrage en politique publique pour l'année 2016. Professeur Savoie, bonjour.
Bonjour. Thank you very much for inviting me here with Tushar, with my colleague. I wish I could be there. I had prior engagements. I won't be in the country, but I wish you a good conference, and I'm delighted that we're able to be part of it through this conversation.
So, Professor Savoie, I would like to start with the very title of your book, which is What is Government Good At? You depict in your book, I will say, a pretty bleak picture of the state of government in Canada, but also abroad. And essentially, to summarize it very briefly, you essentially say that government has gone from a golden age where it could do no wrong to an era now where people question seriously the ability of governments to deliver things. And in that context, a lot of people have begun to wonder, what exactly is government good at? So I have you today to ask you that very question. So what is government good at, Professor Savoie?
Thank you, Richard. And it's a very valid question. I have to tell you that when I told a colleague and a businessman, he said, what are you working on? I told him, the book is What is Government Good At? He looked at me and said, geez, that's going to be a short book. Other colleagues and other people said, you should write What is Government Not Good At? It'll be a much longer book. So all kinds of jokes, but it makes the point. I don't think government is as credible an actor today as it was 40, 50 years ago. And I think we have to sort out a number of reasons why. And a lot of it is miscommunications. I think government is a lot better at doing things than people imagine. I talk about wicked problems. Nobody's going to worry about wicked problems other than government. We have problems with Native communities. Who's going to worry about that if it's not government? Human dignity is terribly important in any society. Who's going to worry about that if it's not government? So there's a number of things that the government has to do, whether it's good at it or not, because nobody else is going to do it. And I would venture to say that government is probably better at it than anybody else, because they have had a number of experience. But also, I think government can claim credit for being good at laying the conditions for economic success. And as an example, I'm going to take up my iPhone here. Every piece of this, every single piece of this, government has had a hand through research and development, through all kinds of initiative, purchasing agreements. And so government has laid down the basis for a lot of economic success. And the reason some countries like the United States, Canada, Britain is doing better is because we have a much more mature, solid public sector, not as corrupt. And so that matters. And so I think there's a lot of people making snark remarks about government not being able and so on. It's an easy way to take a shot. I don't think it reflects reality, and that's what I want to do in my book. Now, the question you then ask is, why is it that it's not viewed as positive light as it was 40, 50 years ago? I think that's right. I think that's true. But you have to bear in mind that 40, 50 years ago, we had to have a government that could bring together the public interest, that could define it. We were fighting a war. And if government is not there to fight the war, who's going to fight the war? And so it was easy for government to tell Canadians, we have to come together and fight this war. So building a kind of consensus to fight a war tends to focus a lot of energy, a lot of progress. Asking Canadians to define programs to help fellow Canadians to grow the modern economy, I think it was a lot easier to zero in on the public interest than is the case now. Now, it's much more difficult. Regionalism in Canada is far more important than people imagine. And so it's much more difficult.
Well, that brings me to the question of, we'll call it the question of perception versus reality. You mentioned in your book that during the golden age of government, during the war and the 25 years after, that it was a time when people were deferential towards authority, be they priests or politicians, and let's say it, that educational levels were not as high as they are today. So, everybody's a critic these days, and we don't tend to defer to authority in the same manner that we did before, but at the same time, that reflects the fact that we have more people doing more critical thinking. So how much is it a matter of perception, or that the situation seems to have deteriorated in terms of the answer to what's government good at, and how much is a reality?
Well, we're speaking with public servants today, and I would tell the public servants that your job is only for the brave. It's a very difficult job to be a public servant. People don't realize it, but if you combine the social media, and everybody can take a shot, if you can, and I think this is a major problem that we've not addressed, and it's a serious problem that we need to address, the number of oversight bodies that a public servant has to deal with today is incredible. I mean, there was a day when, talk about back in the good old days, good old days, on a Friday night, C.D. Howe would sit down and look at his portfolio and look at government decisions and look at the ones that were coming in, would adjust his portfolio. That's true. That's reality. He would call his friends, say, look, there's going to be a buying opportunity here. Let's go. It happened. It happened quite regularly.
So maybe it wasn't that much of a golden age in terms of accountability and transparency back then.
Not at all. In fact, government was not transparent. And it took some pride in not being transparent. Deals were cooked. Today, we've reached a level of transparency that, in my view, makes it's perhaps easy for the media, perhaps it's easy for people outside, but for people inside government, they walk around with somebody looking over their shoulders all the time. And it's making life very difficult.
Obviously, we've it's not that we've gone too far in terms of transparency and accountability. Is that we tend to add new layers upon layers of transparency requirements and in terms of reporting, and we don't remove the other ones that were there before. So it becomes quite burdensome. And with time, a lot of public servants will spend a lot their time focused on that part of government and less on the process of articulating public policy, what we can call the public policy or the common good. And to a large extent, it's because there's not as much of a market for it as there was before. And that's something you mentioned in your book, that 30, 40 years ago, the public interests, at least the things that were brought forward by politicians to citizens, were usually prepared by bureaucrats, career bureaucrats, which they had the ear of politicians, and they were just playing the central role. And nowadays, they're competing with with courts, they're competing with lobbyists, they're competing with private sector groups that increasingly have the ear of the government, and that might be frustrating for career bureaucrats. So what's your take on that, and what do we need to do so that we rediscover some sort of an ability to have bureaucrats who are articulating also the common interest and are being listened to by their political leaders?
Those are a series of very good questions. Let me start by saying you have to have a market for speaking truth to power. You have to have politicians who are willing to receive that truth. I'm not sure it's there anymore. What's different today is that we have career politicians that started in politics when they were 25, 26 years old, the same time as a public servant joined the public service. So the career politicians think that he knows the machinery of government, he knows history of policy, he knows how it works, as well as the public servant. Back in the days of Mitchell, Sharp, and so on, they went out, ran businesses. Pierre Trudeau taught at the University of Montreal. They went out and did things. They came to government with a different perspective. They were open to advice, much more open to advice. Career politicians will say to a career public servant, well, I know as much as you do about that, so back off. That's one factor. I think the other factor, in terms of the last point that you've raised, one thing that we can't overlook is that we've changed the process substantially, perhaps not as obvious to the outside world as it is to the inside world, but I had the good fortune to have a long, long conversation, many actually, with Jack Mannion, who was a senior deputy minister, who told me that in the late 1950s, he was a public servant, director level in immigration, and there was a crisis. Europe, Eastern Europe, people coming in. And he described to me how that policy was struck. PMO didn't exist. PCO was irrelevant. The minister was relevant. The deputy minister was terribly relevant. They crafted something. They went to the deputy minister. They had a good chinwag about it. Then to the minister. The minister took the package and went to cabinet, had it out. That's how it worked. It doesn't work like that anymore. It really doesn't work like that. PMO will tell somebody down the line, that's what we want. Just cook it. We know what we want, just tell us. And so it is much more difficult for a public servant to speak truth to power because the market is not as there as much as it was.
So speaking of markets, we talked about the absence of a market discipline in bureaucracy in government, and we know that when the prime minister is not looking, the propensity, the natural tendency of government is to grow and grow and grow. And then, usually after an election where you have a majority government and some sort of budgetary restriction, we're going to go through a program review where usually we're going to have very generic targets and we're going to have to cut across the board. And that's how government controls its size over time, but this is far from optimal. Are we bound to see history repeat itself in the future, or is there a way that we can do these things better?
Charles, let's hope that there's a way. And here we can speak to public servants. I think they have to accept part of the blame here. Because if you let public servants go at it without the Prime Minister interview, without a program review, without the Prime Minister saying enough is enough, if you let public servants have their way only, you will see government grow and grow and grow. And we've set up a system that there's an incentive for public servants to grow. There's no incentive for them to manage better. Still, after all these new public management measures for the past 30 years, we still haven't figured out how to make that work. And so, unless we do so, I think the public service will have a very difficult time to regain credibility. And it's incumbent upon them to come up with a process, to look at their own activities. I tell the story, a deputy minister told me that he managed his department in Ottawa quite well. He was able to prune it, he was able to cut bad spending. Then they had a program review with an across-the-board cut. He suffered the same cut as the next guy who didn't manage this program. And so that deputy minister said, next time around, a light bulb's going to go on here. So it's incumbent upon public servants, perhaps far more than it is upon politicians, to come up with a process, to redefine, and to make sure that we no longer have the problem in government that the major issue is not what government spends on new things, it's what it spends on old things.
Absolutely, and the challenge becomes the public service has to become better at doing this, or else it's gonna fuel cynicism in the population generally, and people are going to ask whether there's an element of self-serving in here, and it's always a challenge. And that leads me to my next question, which you mentioned in your book that nowadays, approximately, I believe it's around 43% of bureaucrats are now located in Ottawa. And that percentage has gone up from, what, was it in the 20s about
it was 28%.
28%.
It was 35 years ago, it was 28%. Today is 43%. Growing to 44.
Yes, and the question I would have for you is that it's probably easier to establish benchmarks and determine what is the appropriate staffing level for an organization, let's say, such as pensions and benefits that's located in Shediac near here. But when it comes to defining performance benchmarks for those who, as you say, who are above the fold, or what is it again?
Fault line?
Above the fault lines that you have in your book, it's probably harder for that. And what we find is that growth has been concentrated in those areas, unless I'm mistaken. So there might be an issue here with, I don't know, it's again this ability of performance measurement, or the ability of determining what exactly is the contribution of the various public servants, no?
The government has to grow the ability to change course, because clients out there are going to push for change. People in the region deal with clients. People in Ottawa usually don't. They deal with with one another, they deal with the Auditor General, they deal with central agencies, they respond to requests for information, and so on. And so when you remove people closer, that are closer to clients or to Canadians, there's a risk, there's a problem. The risk is that the impetus for change will not be there. And I think we've reached that. The old saying that the government has to learn how to steer better and not row, if we don't figure out how to row better, we're not going to have the mandate to steer. And so we better learn how to row. My argument is that to learn how to row, you got to be close to the people that you're serving. You got to respond to them. The ADM in Ottawa really doesn't know what the fisherman in Buctos thinks. It's too far removed. The director of fisheries in the region knows what the fisherman in Buctos thinks. And unless we learn to respond to those needs and those requirements, we're going to run into a heck of a wall.
You remind me of Peter Drucker was saying that results are on the outside, and inside all you see are costs. So if an organization focuses too much inwards, after a while it loses contact with the customers or the clients, or in this case, the taxpayers and the citizens. So this, to me, brings me to another question related to articulating the public good, which you mentioned earlier on. And I think this is quite challenging in those times, particularly given what happened last year, is that you say that access to politicians is by ordinary citizens is not as easy as it may have been in the past. You say that it's far easier for businesses who are well organized and public lobbies that are well organized to access politicians than it is for ordinary citizens. And you even go as far as to quote, not go as far, but you even mention the Supreme Court Chief Justice, who said that she believed that access to justice is much easier for those who have money and are well organized. So, are we at risk here of not engaging with what we call south of the border the forgotten men and women? Is this a major challenge?
It is hard. It's an important challenge. And I think there's a number of lessons learned from Donald Trump. We Canadians are not enamored with Donald Trump. We see all kinds of faults, rightly. But he let's not deny the fact that he tapped into something. He tapped into anger. He tapped into people saying, this big government, we have no control over it. It's a show. Every 4 years, we vote. But we're not running anything. We're not deciding anything. We're not holding anybody to account. Government is run by a number of career politicians, career public servants, who respond to the wishes of lobbyists, of big business, and we are the forgotten people. And Trump was able to articulate that. At some point, somewhere in Canada, somebody is going to try to articulate that, and heaven forbid if he or she has success at it, because government has to learn to back away, to go over the heads of lobbyists, go over the heads of the media, go over the heads of many people and deal with Canadians. That's what democracy is all about. If we lose that, we lose the essence of governing.
Your mention of going over the heads of lobbyists and over the heads of the media reminds me of the speech that Trudeau delivered in his final. Pierre Trudeau delivered in his final address in Ottawa in 1984.
At the Savoie Arena, yeah.
Yeah. And Trudeau père is known for having sought election in his first mandate under the heading, a very broad heading of the Just Society. And nowadays, we're more into political marketing with, growing the middle class and slogans that mean less. And I wonder if government, maybe one of the key challenges of government going forward will be to try to rediscover the common good. It's an old saying, it's an old word, but it seems that we've lost that. It seems that we no longer know as a society where we're headed. It looks like everything we're doing these days is to try, in certain instances, managing decline. In others, is consolidating what we have. And I wonder if, I'm kind of like become over time an expert in population aging, and I wonder if it's not the reflection of a society that's getting older, and that as we get older, it becomes harder to dream about building more when we have to sustain existing programs that we have in place, that we have to sustain the welfare state, and that maybe the government in the end is not as good in managing some form of status quo than in delivering programs during times of phenomenal growth and greater consensus over what needs to be achieved. So to loop back to the original question, I'm just wondering the extent to which we need to cut some slack to government and start dreaming as a society in terms of where we want government to go in the years ahead. I don't know if you have anything to...
Well, no, I have some thoughts, and I think you're quite right, and I'm well aware of your book. You saw transfer payments, aging, it's all linked in government, it's all linked together. It's a very important book. And yes, it is a factor. Older people don't have the vision of building a society. They have a vision of holding on to what they have. But I think there's something even deeper than that. And it's ironic, but a few nights ago on television, there was a single mother who went after the Prime Minister on his cross-country tour. And she said, how can you talk about a carbon tax when all I have left after I pay heating and so on to feed my family is $68 a month? That's what she said. She was in tears. Those are the kinds of Canadians, when I talk about human dignity, those are the kind of Canadians, if we forget the essence of human dignity, government will only be the preserve of the rich, of the wealthy, and of the powerful. If we go there, we lose democracy.
Well, on this note, sur cette note, Donald, j'aimerais te remercier d'une part pour avoir écrit ce livre d'une importance primordiale, d'avoir pris le temps, d'avoir répondu à cette question essentielle pour l'avenir de notre société, et aussi vous remercier au nom de tous les participants à la conférence aujourd'hui. Vous remercier de votre participation, c'est très apprécié.
Un gros merci, Richard.
Merci.
Très apprécié de ma part.